Hello, welcome back. This is the second episode going through Angela Friederici's article on language in the brain. I just found out that the first episode I'd recorded didn't have sound on it. I didn't properly set up the microphone. Um, so I'll re-record that sometime soon. But just thinking about reflecting on that episode, uh, I did a lot of preface and just talking generally, and it reminded me of a point I wanted to make at the first part of this episode. That probably with anything in science, but especially things like neuroscience, uh, things that you want to say about it are built on the findings you have from studies. So people can have different interpretations. There's a saying that we have in political theory anyway. Um, Facts are sacred, but opinion is free. So I gave a lot of opinions in the previous session that I was talking about, but everything builds on the facts, and there's different interpretations people can have, and a lot of the models that people build, in a way, their purpose is to organize. One of their purposes is a kind of way to structure the findings that you find from studies. That's kind of the what models are for, as much as it, less than actually explaining what a finding is. It's a way to organize um, in a person's mind in a way that it can actually apply and use the findings. And in some senses, you can even think that a good model's, especially in a field that's still young and still rapidly developing, as neuroscience is, that a good model is basically organizing, or it's almost like a mnemonic for the findings you have. We have that in law too, actually. So I wanted to come back to that point because I gave some opinions in the previous session, but the opinions don't matter so much as the findings, and being clear about what they are and having good interpretations and having good models. A good model's something that can explain the findings and give some predictive power. So you only, so the stock you put into an opinion is only as good as it can contribute to a model if you're thinking scientifically. And then once you're talking about the human purposes of scientific findings, which I want to get to with neuroscience. Neuroscience is maybe especially special among the sciences because it intersects with the social sciences. And in the social sciences, a unique feature is that they intersect with political and moral values in a way that other, the other sciences, like the earth science and physics and chemistry, don't in the same way. And I don't want to avoid the intersections with these kinds of values. All right. So, but we need a good scientific model of what's happening, and on that we can build. It gives a platform for actually talking about values that come out of what you're, out of the models, out of the theories. Like I said in the last session, talking about the structure of language is really talking about what's special about humanity that separates humans. Not just that what separates humans from animals, but what is it about the structure of the brain that out of which flows language and all the values and narratives and social structures and identity structures that we build out of narratives. And then the structure of language informs that discussion as well. So that's why I think I gave a lot of opinions. So you can just, I think it's okay to just, if you're explicit about it, to kind of separate the different tasks that talking about models does. So we can talk about from just, in terms of the science, what matters is the predictive power of models that you build and the way that models help you understand and organize in your mind the different findings you're finding from studies. They give you suggestions for what new studies you can to tease apart. I think I even started mentioning in the previous session a lot of findings in the neuroscience of language in particular are really entangled with the functions. The types of functions it could be are entangled with each other, and you have to be very clever about study design to disentangle, to tease apart. There could be multiple functions that would have the same results, and to tease those apart, you have to be very clever. And I think that also reminds me just having a respect, maybe even a humility about the limitations, how much we can do with the resources we have, which reminds me of a recent something that Max Schein said in one of Johann and Friends videos. He was looking at a single grain of sugar and thinking about how many millions of molecules are just in this tiny grain that I can barely see, and realize in the kind of brain areas that we're talking about how much function is happening in each one of those minuscule, infinitesimally sized granules. There can be a lot of function packed in there because we're, millions of molecules interacting, and we're trying to make, predictions at such a gross level, at such a high level. Even when you're talking about fMRI scans that have, spatial resolution in the millimeters, that's still wildly large scale. So you should also come in with a certain kind of humility, and your opinions. I think it's good when one gives opinions to give them with that kind of humility. It's a difficult science. So anyway, but part of the reason why I'm saying this now, that there's another saying that you get from things like literary theory, when you start getting too derailed from whatever phenomenon that you're talking about, which can happen once you start getting away from the practice of building a model or thinking about how one builds a model, or what we're learning from studies, what studies are contributing to help us build a model that will help us understand the findings, the phenomenon that we're studying. One kind of rule of thumb that can keep you from detaching from that is to get back to the phenomenon. The quote I always remember from literary theory: get back to the text. Once you're not talking about the text, you've kind of derailed and you're talking about something else. And that's a good kind of rule of thumb here too. So I gave a lot of opinions in the previous session, but at the end of the day, we should just get back to the studies themselves. And anything you want to say, that's like the foundation, is the studies, and trying to give interpretations and thinking about limitations of studies, but just getting back to the studies themselves, the findings, the kind of hard empirical work. Everything builds off of that. And in some senses, your opinion is only as good as it has findings as a solid foundation for them. So if your opinion is about things that go beyond the solid foundations, then they're not solid to that extent. So that's why I was happy to get to this second part, where we're actually going to get to the hard science and actually start talking about the studies, so it's not just open-ended philosophizing and just thinking through these meta issues. It's important to look at meta issues, but we should get to the findings. And on the other side, once you've walked through a lot of findings, then you're on much better ground to kind of be more speculative. And the kind of gaps that are left open after looking at the sciences. Neuroscience is also special in that sense that it's really, it has such a rapid turnover that even in a course of a few years, 3 or 4 years, entire mainstream theories can be archaic, can be outdated. This article we're looking at here, you can see 2011, already 11 years ago. Um, so, anyway, I'm just saying, even looking at the findings themselves, you have to have a kind of humility. But it's good to get. The reason why I'm looking at this article is because it's a good, well, as it says here, what's good about this source? It's a good primer for some of the major areas, functions, time course, language processing in the brain. There are certain papers that, I don't know if I can use the word timeless, but they kind of set the structure of whatever field you're looking at. And I feel like this is a really great paper for someone just coming in to the neuroscience of language. You would want to start with a paper like this, which is why I'm starting with this paper, because it kind of walks through, it walks through the major areas and the major time course of language processing, that whatever studies you're going to look at, it's good to have this as kind of a bird's eye view of the portrait of the entire project of trying to understand the neurobiology of language. So that's what I really like about this, and the fact that there's parts about it that I disagree, I think is a pro in this case, because the way you can make progress, I think, is when you're looking at different theories and you can kind of see the different hinge points, in the sense that you see certain findings and it's suggestive of multiple interpretations, and you can find support for one of the other interpretations. I like the fact that this paper is good at drawing out those kind of hinge points and being suggestive about multiple interpretations, and the fact that I have disagreements, or I have things to say about its findings that are suggestive. The suggestions of other interpretations come to me, and that's a pro for this kind of paper, that it's organized in a solid way, and it cuts, like it says, it cuts straight to central issues, and it's an archetype in the sense that she lines up findings. She'll lay out, this is a kind of area or function. These are the kind of mainstream interpretations out there. Here's some studies that support it. Here's some studies that don't appear to support it, but here's some explanations. And here's some things that we just don't know about, but this is what we're finding. You want a paper like that, better a paper that you disagree with, but gives you a good structure within which you can really get into the details of interpretations, than a paper that you completely agree with but doesn't have that open-endedness and kind of leaves you at a blank wall. After I finish, when I read a paper like this, it gives me a lot of ideas that I want to follow up on to understand more. So that's why I like going through this paper, is at the end of it you'll have a better sense about the kinds of questions we want to be asking, and hopefully it's motivating. Okay, so anyway, this is the paper again, from structure to function, which we talked about in the previous session. So it is older, but all right, still valuable. So this is a kind of epitaph opening quote. Our words are bounded by an invisible grammar, which is embedded in the brain. Invisible grammar. So in the previous session, I talked a lot about the Chomskyan thing. In this paper, this paper will go over a lot about structures embedded in the brain, functions embedded in the brain. The idea of an invisible grammar isn't something that this paper per se follows up on. It's suggestive of the kind of functions that are being mediated by the areas that it looks at, but the kind of grammar, in the previous session, I went over some of the debate about what the idea of an invisible grammar even means. There's the sense of, there's definitely a capacity being I shouldn't say definitely because people disagree about it, but it seems there is a capacity of humans do have the capacity to instantiate grammar, and that's a different question than the mechanism by which this capacity is kind of developed. If it's kind of built in by DNA, um, some people would might want to say go so far as to say actual rules of grammar themselves are embedded in DNA, and but a lot of the recent findings, the kind of writing on the wall, which was what I was talking about last time, was that a lot of areas, neural areas, capacities are developed by bootstrap learning, and this seems to be another case. So invisible grammar in that sense is the capacity to bootstrap grammar, and then also the sense in which concepts are linked. When we're looking at the actual studies, I can explain what I mean, but a link grammar is one where actual sequential elements in some acoustic signal are linked in a rule-like way. And I had a whole spiel I went in the last session about even what does rule-like mean. So I was doing an open-ended discussion in the previous session. When we're actually looking at the studies, we can be a lot more precise or detailed about what we're talking about. So, anyway. The goal is to describe the structural and functional neural network underlying sentence comprehension and how this process evolves over time as a sentence is perceived. I'm going to talk about it in a bit more when we actually look at the structures she's looking at, but this isn't talking about every part of language. So she's focusing very specifically on sentence comprehension, and how the understanding of a sentence is perceived as a process over time. So there's a lot that language does that goes beyond just quote-unquote mere comprehension, understanding the basic sense of a sentence from the grammar, connecting it to the semantics. Alright, so we're not talking about everything in grammar, which is fine, but language does come in like a context, so we can also recognize kind of the bigger context that language happens in, but it's fine to define your goal to be a specific, Last time I talked about some of the issues of being too hyper-focused on grammar, as all of language there's a bias in linguistics, what some people would call a bias of being too grammar-focused to the expense of other parts. So the idea of just focusing on sentence comprehension by itself, critics from that bent of mind, this would still be part of their criticism that this kind of focus by itself is part of that bias. But there's certain processes for understanding, just even in terms of signal processing functionality that have to be done one way or another. Anyway, we're just focusing. So it's very, whichever side you might come out about whether that's a bias or not, you'd want to look at these structures because they're going to be, in any exploration of language, these are like core structures you would want to look at anyway. Okay, so different approach. Or the approach. So we're going to be looking at a time course of sentence comprehension. Again, the goal is linking structure and function. And I talked last time also about modularity. But the idea that there's certain structural modules and a succession of processing. So you have a logical succession in the sense that you have downstream modules, you have to have upstream modules that get certain work that later modules will depend on, whereas there could be, time course of sentence comprehension. there could be different possibilities of a certain like strict logical sequence where A has to come before B, but there are other structures in which A, B, and C can happen in parallel, but they can mutually constrain each other. And also just the pathways, the successive pathways that link different modules. So when we're talking about structure, we're talking about brain area, modularistic brain areas that are connected in certain structural ways that give suggestions about structure, and the time course is both of these taken together. The neuroanatomy of the network, so the areas we're looking at and how they're connected, the network of how they're connected, and the time course of processing along different pathways. And then as we walk through the processes of sentence comprehension, it's supposed to, by looking at that, it's going to be suggestive of the actual processing of language comprehension. So we're going to walk through the processes from the basic auditory processing through syntactic processes to semantic processing. The most basic finding that anything has to start with is that syntactic and semantic processing is heavily left hemisphere lateralized. The brain has two halves, hemispheres that have very similar looking structures. Many functions are anatomically, in terms again of the network and the connections, would be the same on two sides of a hemisphere. But there are a lot of processes where functions aren't, for vision, for example, where one half of your visual field goes to the opposite hemisphere, and you can see obviously if they're crossing the two sides of the visual field, then both hemispheres would have to be basically doing the same processing. Language is special in the sense that it's heavily lateralized. There's a lot of areas where you could say there's small differences people argue that there's small differences in function lateralized between the two different hemispheres. But for language, it's heavily left hemisphere lateralized. Whereas prosody processing is right hemisphere lateralized. This is like a really high level view. Prosody is like the way tone and pacing in one's voice can give signals. If you think about it like in envelope terms, phonemes give some information about the words, and word structure gives information about the syntax of a sentence. Whereas prosody, the acoustic envelope is much wider over the course of a couple of seconds, like at the end of a sentence where your pitch will go up if you're asking a question. That's really right hemisphere lateralized. So she says her main focus is neuroimaging studies, magnetic resonance imaging, functional EEGs, which are electric potentials. So different imaging where, the images of the brain where activation is highlighted in various ways, and less on lesion and patient studies. Lesion studies are, of course, when there's a lesion, a hole in the brain somewhere, and you look at the breakdown that occurs, which can inform the structure that was lesioned, what its function was, and just patient studies, just behavioral studies also generally. When people do different behavioral studies on language related tasks, like the timing of different tasks, the breakdowns. Anyway, but this is the heavy focus on neuroimaging. Okay, the language network. So here's a map of the brain. These are the colored areas are the core areas that she wants to look at for this paper. Core areas of the language network. So this is going right back to that point I was making a minute ago about being grammar heavy. So there's a lot more areas of the brain that are involved in language that are not represented in this list. So I'm going to go over the list in a minute. Well, let's go over it now. And then I can mention some of the others that aren't there and why I think they're not there. That go kind of beyond this core, the basic syntax and arguably semantics. We'll talk about that in a second. Classically, there's a classic model of language processing. It's called the house model. The two 19th century neuroanatomists studying the brain were Broca and Wernicke. This area here is called Broca's area, and this part of the temporal lobe, the posterior 2/3 of it, is called Wernicke's area. I think it's listed here, Wernicke's area, and then Broca's area. So classically, these are the two core structures of language processing that they've known for over 100 years now, maybe even 150. Broca's area is in the inferior frontal gyrus. So this is the frontal lobe, this part highlighted in blue, the inferior frontal part. So area 40, well, we'll talk about it in more detail in a minute. This is kind of more settled as Broca's area. So then we have what's classically labeled Wernicke's area in the superior temporal gyrus. There's 4 lobes of the brain, frontal lobe in the blue highlighting here. Purple is called the parietal lobe. This greenish part in the back is occipital lobe. If someone is studying language from the perspective of reading, you're going to be looking at occipital lobe. But outside of reading, you're largely looking at frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe. And then temporal lobe is this part in orange, and you can see this has 3 sulci, so superior, gyrus. 3 gyri, so gyri is the part that sticks out, sulcus is the part that goes in, and then this, in terms of basic cartography, this division here is called the Sylvian fissure, and then we have the central sulcus that divides the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. So the area right around the Sylvian fissure, parasylvian cortex, is core to language. So you can see Broca's area and Wernicke's area is really, and there's also some other areas here we'll talk about more in a minute. This is superior temporal gyrus, and the blue part is the middle temporal gyrus. We have inferior temporal gyrus here, but that's not so much of a focus for this paper. So like I said, Wernicke's area is considered the back posterior 2/3 of superior temporal gyrus, but one thing to note is that there's a lot less agreement on about where Wernicke's area. If you look up Wernicke's area, what's called Wernicke's area, it's not as monolithically cohesive as Broca's area. So everybody uses Broca's area for this part. People don't actually use the term Wernicke's area. They can say Brodmann's area 22, this number here, because there's disagreement about what Wernicke's area even is. Different studies give wildly different regions. They'll circle different areas about what's included in it, and it turns out what's called Wernicke's area has a lot of a lot of different functions happen in it, to the point that it might not be useful to contain it as a single named structure. So, like this kind of paper, you introduce an area as Wernicke's area, and then you don't mention Wernicke's area again. You just talk directly about the specific structures you're talking about. Okay. Blue is middle temporal gyrus, and then inferior parietal and angular gyrus. So, angular gyrus is this angled part at the intersection between temporal lobe and parietal lobe, so over here. And inferior parietal. Anyway, this is parietal lobe, so inferior is this bottom part here, the part that borders temporal lobe. Broadening areas. You can see that these areas are numbered. So since I want this to be kind of introduction to neuroscience generally, I feel like explaining these kinds of things. That's the added value I want to give when I'm giving these talks at all. So Brockman's areas. So these numbers were originally listed in a kind of brain map by Brodmann, also in the late 19th century. They're divided by cytoarchitectonic features. So cytoarchitectonic is particularly looking at cortex. So there's white matter and gray matter in a brain. Gray matter is, you can inflate the brain. I think I have some images of inflated models. Like it's like a balloon that you blow up. This is it. This is an inflated model. So you see the gyrus and the sulci. Gyrus is a part that sticks out, and sulci are parts that go in. But you can see from an inflated perspective, it doesn't really. The fact that it's a gyrus or sulcus doesn't really matter so much because they're connected. This is just a kind of skin. So cortex is the very top layer. Gray matter. It has unmyelinated. It's thick with cell bodies, so it gives it a more gray color. And then in between, I think we have white matter. If we look at a coronal slice of the brain, so you can see the gray matter on the skin and the outside, and then inside we call this white matter. These are connections, distinct connections between cortex from different areas, follows pathways, and the reason it's white is because these are like the axons, these are like the cables connecting distant parts. They're heavily covered with a kind of white fatty substance we call a myelin sheath, white matter. So speaking of, where these Brodmann areas come from is, if you look at just the gray matter in a microscope, they tend to be in layers. So there's 6 paradigmatic layers of cells that make up the gray matter cortex. And then cytoarchitectonic divisions means the structure of those 6 layers. What Brodmann did was looking at this in a microscope. He would separate areas when the cytoarchitectonic structure would completely change, and that's how he would just circle an area where the cytoarchitectonic, these 6 layers had basically a similar structure, and would number that. And when it when it changes, you put a new number. As it turns out, there's a lot of areas where the divisions can adjust over the course of a area. So you can do further subdivisions within these. But if you see, area 22 here is a really large space comparatively. Whereas if you look at, area 43 or 41, they actually go down into the sulcus, but they're a much smaller area. Okay. What is the difference? It turns out that the different structure of the layers is generally linked to functional differences. This is not completely true. It's more nuanced than that. It's not like function perfectly overlaps. And as we were saying, there's a lot of areas where the cytoarchitectonic structure is on a spectrum from one end to another. So functional divisions can be tricky. But it's a kind of good starting point, and as it turns out, they're a good starting point for understanding regions of the brain. Okay. One really major difference, common theme among differences is layer 4. How solid the layer 4 structure. If it's very structured, where it's layer 4 is very thick and visible, we call that granular cortex, and sometimes it's very sporadic or spotty, and sometimes it's like there's not an area layer 4 there at all, which we call agranular. That's a common way that you can divide these numbers, and that has a certain meaning. If there's that layer 4, that tends to be cortex that's receiving kind of primary, sensory data. It's like the entry point for incoming, down upstream areas. Okay, so I was saying there's parts left out of this map. So we've highlighted Broca's area, Wernicke's area, superior temporal gyrus, medial temporal, middle temporal gyrus. What are some of the parts left out? So for example, all the parts having to do with action. So for example, there are some studies that midbrain areas have functional aspects towards language, which is not really, like I said, the classic theory is it's Wernicke's area, the classic house model. It's a house model. I wish I had an image of it here, but it's this kind of square, and then it has a triangle on top. That's why it's called the classic house model. And the two endpoints, this is Wernicke's area and this is Broca's area. Wernicke's area classically was supposed to be the area where you comprehended language, and Broca's area was the area where you're supposed to perform, where the motor part of language. So the in part is the Wernicke's area, and the out part, the affective and effective part, was Broca's area. And then they had a connection between the two that was called the arcuate-fasciculus, which we'll talk about more. But this is the classic model of language. And then it had at the peak of the cognitive processing that would connect with both, that would kind of link the two, just like other brain areas. So language is supposed to be really contained just in Broca's and Wernicke's area, and that kind of there's still a lot of sectors where this is again what I was talking about, being hyper grammar focused. There's a lot of even modern model. The legacy of that classic model you still kind of see. So obviously this is a lot more, even in this simple picture, this is a lot more complicated than the classic house model of language that Wernicke and Broca developed. That was developed 100 years ago. But there's still that kind of focus that this is the central parts of language. But there's other suggestions that more distant parts of the brain that people didn't normally think that had much to do with language classically actually affect language ability, that appear to have functions. So one example is parts of the midbrain, so like the striate cortex and the basal ganglia, and another area that's being discussed is the cerebellum, which is classically known for fine motor control. It's not even pictured on this, it would be here. So for example, there's a book here. Oh, not here. There's a book I like that I can't put up on the slides, but Philip Lieberman's Human Language in a Reptilian Brain, the Subcortical Basis of Speech, Syntax, and Thought. That looks at the contribution of areas like Broca's area and the cerebellum to language function, which are classically would not be considered having anything to do with language per se. They have to do with... So part of the grand debate is how integrated is language or what is the relationship between language function and action function generally, and action decision making. So cerebellum and the basal ganglia, and parts of the basal ganglia called striate cortex, or the another area that will come to me in a minute, the reticular nucleus. Those parts are involved in action planning generally. So language is also a form of action, but teasing apart, to what extent, a question is to what extent is decision language processing separate from the action context in which it happens. And for example, down here, what we this area, so, and this will get into other areas of the brain that may also be connected with language. Ventral frontal lobe, ventral prefrontal cortex. So you can see frontal operculum, FOP. This is an area that we'll look at in this paper, but generally this direction is dorsal, this direction is ventral. So ventral prefrontal cortex is very much involved with evaluation, the value of certain actions you take, and action planning generally is also, there's a medial side to this. I don't think I have an image of medial. Do I? Medial cortex. Medial is just looking at the hemisphere down inside the medial side, the other side of the medial side. You have a structure here called the cingulate cortex. So anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, is involved with action planning. So you get the valuation in ventral prefrontal cortex, but ACC is the one that's evaluating it in terms of your goals. It's aligning action with goals. It's more complicated than that, but that can play a factor in language. This part in dorsal frontal lobe is structures to do with understanding the thoughts of others, and whether through understanding the thoughts of others, it also gets linked with signal processing generally. So language is also a form of communication. You don't just speak into a vacuum. You speak in a language, in a context, in a signal communicative context, where another agent hearing and understanding your words is part of the processing and part of understanding. So it's this dorsal prefrontal cortex, and then it also wraps around down the medial side. So on the medial side, you have a theory of mind processing to understand what other people are thinking, to kind of also align your action, your planning in terms of what other people, you recognize other people are thinking. So the theory of mind part would be on the medial side, and then the action planning part is on the lateral side. That could be involved. And then back here at the more dorsal parietal lobe is what might be called the parts of language processing that are associated with discourse and narratives. So there are higher levels of language use. Any kind of category of action can be divided into different, levels of grain. So from phonetic, language has this kind of layered structure too, where you have, your processing basic units of language of the phonemes. Even before that, the spectral, the spectral graph of an acoustic signal coming in and dividing it up into phonetic units at the bottom, and then into basic structural and phrasal structures to semantic structures that are giving meaning. But then higher levels, reciprocity structures of emotional valency. But as you get into higher levels, then you start getting into discourse. Discourse patterns where someone speaks for a little while and then they pause to allow another person, and this kind of give and take is a higher. It's still technically language processing, but at a much higher level than kind of the core areas. And then also building a narrative. Like, it's language is not just sentences giving discrete meanings, but the meanings will add up over many sentences to create a narrative that will inform the situation, the social situation one finds oneself in. So that kind of processing, so narrative structure, that has been associated with dorsolateral prefrontal lobe, and then on the medial side you have what's called the precuneus, which is just on the medial side of this, and then just under that you have again this part here on the medial side was called the cingulate cortex. So the posterior cingulate cortex, PCC, is also associated with those kind of narrative and putting language action in a social context, in a narrative context, in the situation you find yourself in. There's a reason that happens in parietal cortex. Now, there's different themes that go with these different lobes. Parietal cortex is supposed to be it links, it connects affective signals, sensory information that's been processed on with action. So there's a reason why you would have narratives and kind of an understanding of the world around you being processed in parietal lobe. Frontal lobe is associated with executive decision making, and then temporal lobe is associated with kind of nominalizing, attaching language, or not just language, but for example also visual images you have with objects in the world, out of which meaning can be developed. And then another area that's also connected to language that's not talked much about here is, I was just talking about frontal lobe is executive decision making. This gyrus right in front of the central sulcus is called, it says premotor cortex. This is motor cortex. And then the part, so this 4 here, primary motor cortex. And then the area just in front of it is premotor cortex, which is kind of more associative processing, more meta processing. Primary motor cortex has been classically understood as having like motor instructions. Like Frank Gunther uses this term, a score. He's talking about vocal articulation. We might get into it more, but it's kind of the actual motions one would go through for certain kinds of paradigmatic actions are encoded in motor cortex. This is where the kind of plan is put to a score, and then the score sent down to, like I was saying earlier, basal ganglia to actually be implemented down to the muscles, effective pathways. So if you read someone like Frank Gunther, or like that Lieberman book I was mentioning earlier, you focus a lot on the motor cortex's contribution towards language. It's not focused on here. So you can basically see it once you've got syntax giving a semantic structure to language. That's what this article cares about. So the parts that are happening later, there's not much focus in this paper. There's not much focus on the motor instructions, how language planning is actually connected to the motor instructions that are being sent down to the vocal articulators. There's not much attention on the the social context or the action context in which language is developed. There's not much focus on the valuation, the value of, so for example, coming up with multiple things you want to say, and then structures that mediate, that might, inhibitory mechanisms where you think of something to say and there's an inhibitory mechanism that says, oh, I shouldn't say that in this situation. And then certain, like exclamations that really push through certain statements. They short circuit these inhibitory to make, like blurting out certain things that just get fast forwarded through that are happening in these kind of action or the evaluation ACC ventral prefrontal cortex. There's not attention on that. There's not attention on the discourse side, the building a narrative, which is later parts of language processing once you've got the semantics in place. Okay, so we're focusing a lot on core syntax, auditory processing, syntax, and semantics. That kind of early core language. So that's what we mean by language network in this. But I wanted to say right up front, go into some detail, that there are a lot of other areas of the brain that are involved in language. This takes, and again, going to some of the things I talked about last time, people that think that language studies are too hyper focused on grammar as the end all be all of language processing, they're going to worry about too much focus on certain structures at the expense of looking at other structures in the context. Okay, I've said enough about that, I think. And we'll get into more of it when we're actually looking at the structures themselves. So, which we can start doing now. Okay, so let's start with Broca's area. So as a common definition, the cytoarchitectonic structure, which was again the structure of the layers, the two core Brodmann areas are 44 and 45. So here you can see here's Brodmann's area 44 and Brodmann's area 45. 45 in particular kind of lines up with a gyrus here that's a triangle looking like pars apicularis, and it also starts diving down into this is kind of going in the medial direction through the Sylvian fissure, and this also says pars triangularis. This is the triangle part I was meaning, which is just anterior to area 45, so area 5 and 29. Cytoarchitectonic structure is not the only way that you can look at the structure of a brain area. We also have here receptoarchitectonic structure. So receptors are about the kind of binding receptors used. So I think at some point I'll do a session just on the structure of neurons. But basically neurons have a solid body, and the kind of two basic parts are an axon that sends a signal out, and then dendrites that receive, that's kind of this forked structure that receives signals from the axons of other neurons. Where they meet is at a synapse, and across that synapse are neurotransmitters, and there are binding receptors that when they receive the proper in a kind of lock and key mechanism, which is an oversimplification, they will register the neurotransmitter. And if there's enough signals, they build up an electric potential, and when the electric potential at just the area just in front of an axon, which is called the hillock, when that potential goes over a threshold, which means it's receiving enough signals in a short enough time, then it will trigger its own action potential, which will send electric potential signal down the axon, and I'll talk more about that later. But anyway, the kind of receptor that's used in the synapses, the binding the receptors to which external signals like neurotransmitters bind to, that they use. I think this could also be the well, anyway, okay, yeah, those kind of binary receptors. So, for example, that would divide Area 45 into an anterior area and a posterior area. So 45A and P. Anterior means in the rostral in the forward direction. Posterior is in the backwards direction, also called caudal. And then Area 4 and 4 gets divided into a dorsal area and a ventral area, D and V. And then the whole thesis of this paper is that function may follow structure. So if we were trying to understand Broca's area, we would want to look at activation we would consider that activation may vary by these different structural areas. So that's the suggestion, and we can try to understand studies through that lens. So that's Broca's area. Okay. So I mentioned earlier, remember the house study, the house model, the classic house model of language. In that base of the house, where at the two endpoints we had Wernicke's area and Broca's area, the two down points, the area going into Wernicke's area is an acoustic signal. This is the afferent signal coming from your ears, the acoustic signal that goes into Wernicke's area. It does processing to understand comprehension. And then it was connected to Broca's area, which did in the classic model, was the motor part of language, the performative part that had the efferent signal going down to the vocal articulators, the muscles actually articulating language, and those two were connected by a pathway. So we're going to look at Broca's and STG's connectivity. STG again is superior temporal gyrus, this part in green, the back 2/3 particularly. So in that house model, that connection between them was called the articulate fasciculus, even before they found the connection between them. The reason they had this house model was the use of that model was to explain certain categories of language deficiency, which is called aphasia. And it was particularly developed, I think it was during the Franco-Prussian War. Anyway, whenever they had a war, people would get shot in the head, and that would have a very localized lesion, and they would look at forms of language disorders that would happen when people were lesioned, when they were shot in this part of the head versus this part of the head. And they found when people were shot when they would get lesions in Broca's area, they would lose the motor functions of speaking. They would speak in a very halted way. Whereas but they would understand. It would be really, they couldn't say no. I remember watching videos of people with Broca's aphasia. This is called Broca's aphasia because it's Broca's area that was disordered, that was lesioned. They couldn't say metatalk, so no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And we watched on this video someone, maybe even been a live person, they tried like 15 times and couldn't say that. They can say like really cow, water, really core words that don't, and it's in a very halting way. Whereas Wernicke's aphasia, if people are lesioned here, they can speak very fluently, but there's no sense to it. It's like a very fluent word salad that doesn't make any sense. So that's where they got the idea. This is language comprehension and this is language performance. And then the idea of the connection between them two was called conductive aphasia, which is they could understand, they could comprehend sentences. They can show their comprehension in other ways than speaking, and they showed language comprehension and they showed fine language ability, but the two parts didn't talk to each other. So that's why they had this concept that there has to be a link between them that's been severed, and they find people that, in certain kind of lesions that seem to have broken the connection, where they have these two, comprehension and performance, intact, but something in the connection between the two has been severed, where the comprehending, the fluently speaking part isn't connected to the comprehending part, but they can show their comprehension through other ways, something like that. Okay. Today we understand what's called a two-stream model. So the modern model for language, and I think the even more developed model of the two-stream model would even come after this paper. So this is still 2011, but even in 2011 they had the idea of the two-stream model, ventral path and the dorsal path. There's some history to the two-stream model. A lot of neuroscience theory building comes from investigations of visual cortex. And in visual cortex, there's very much a ventral model, a ventral stream, and a dorsal stream. We call it a stream because they're like, it's a network and that are largely independent. So if you cut off the stream in one line, everything downstream gets cut off, but only down one stream. So the other stream is in parallel. So you can, they're independent streams. So you can cut one and the other stream will go through just fine. It's interesting I bring up that history because, not only is it suggestive that brain areas can have two streams, the idea of a dual stream model, but it's there's kind of a thematic similarity between ventral stream and dorsal stream for language as there is for vision. In a sense, this is the acoustic ventral stream and the ventral acoustic stream, and then there's the visual ventral visual dorsal stream and visual ventral stream. Dorsal stream is going through parietal cortex, and as I was saying earlier, parietal cortex is integrating sensory information. This area, remember I mentioned that this is the central sulcus again. The gyrus just in front of it was motor cortex that has like action plans, motor scores. The area just behind it is called sensory cortex, which has the different sensory information coming from all over the body. And then when you have a stream going through parietal cortex, the theme is that you are integrating that signal with other information coming in. And that's what I was talking about, putting language in a social and situational context that's happening through a dorsal stream. But more specifically, it's integrating the signal with muscle action planning. So for visual dorsal stream, they sometimes put it as a what and a where stream. So when it goes through temporal, the ventral stream going through the temporal lobe is about connecting objects with nominalization, connecting signals with objects, like nominalization. Like when you see something, you recognize it as a bike. That's something that's happening in the ventral stream. Whereas dorsal stream is about, if you're trying to grab something in space in front of you, coordinating your hand, the eye-hand coordination, coordinating things you see with things in the world, the muscle planning that's happening through the dorsal stream. So language, you can understand the dual stream of the language with that kind of very similar theme. It's different in a way, but if you understand that the dorsal stream for language is coordinating language with the actual, so for example, the actual articulatory instructions for articulating language, that's happening through the dorsal stream and through Also, its connection with motor cortex, which is right next to Broca's area, how close these are. Whereas the parts about semantics and connecting acoustic signals with objects in the world, and then connecting syntax to semantics, that's something that happens more in a ventral stream. So you can kind of, if you think about an analogy with the two-stream model of vision, it's, can help you remember the dual-stream model for language. We'll talk more about it when we get to functions. So for right now, we're just talking about anatomy and connectivity. So we're talking about the connections between these areas. So again, a dorsal stream and a ventral stream, and then there are two connections for each, which are called dorsal 1 and dorsal 2, and then ventral 1 and ventral 2. So dorsal 2 is this dark blue one, which connects posterior STG by the dorsal part to the posterior part of Broca's area. And then the two major pathways doing that is, again, our arcuate fasciculus, which I already mentioned before. That was the original connection between Wernicke's area and Broca's area. In the classic house model was the arcuate fasciculus, so that's in the dorsal model. So again, that's connecting language comprehension with language processing with actual motor commands. And superior longitudinal fasciculus, which goes further out into other areas. So here she's listed this connection as dealing with top-down control. You can understand, like, if this is the kind of high-level understanding of language, controlling the motor commands, how it would be a kind of top-down control, drawing predictions about incoming information. She's thinking about the top-down control in the opposite direction now. What she's talking about is there'll be a kind of template phrase structure that's built in Broca's area that's giving predictions about the incoming acoustic signal, and it'll match the incoming signal with kind of that template, and it can do some kind of top-down analysis on the incoming signal that's happening over this stream. And just facilitating integration, but that's part of that classic house model, integrating signal processing with motor commands and planning. And syntax structure. Okay, which is what this is, higher level syntactics and semantic connection. So this is kind of the older model, again, part of the house model. Semantics was supposed to be happening in Wernicke's area, syntax is supposed to be happening in Broca's area, and it was the arcuate fasciculus that was connecting the two. Okay, then we have the light one, premotor cortex to posterior STG, the arcuate fasciculus and the superior longitudinal fasciculus. Bottom-up processing. So this was audio motor tuning to language, so especially infants. This is Frank Gunther's DIVA model, develops this concept, and I think I'm going to do a whole session just on that book. Audio motor tuning, especially when infants bootstrap language. Basically, you have an acoustic signal here, and then you have motor signals here, and you bootstrap the motor instructions to create the acoustic signals. That's the bootstrapping model. That's Frank Gunther's DIVA model, is integrating an acoustic signal with motor signals that are bootstrapped off the... what it means is you have a kind of provisional motor command to create that acoustic signal. The infant can try to speak that, and then they'll hear the mismatch. So this will give a feed-forward signal about what that acoustic signal should sound like, and if there's a mismatch with the acoustic signal they wanted to make, then that gives instructions. You get feedback how is a mismatch, and that will give instructions about how to modify the muscle signals, and you keep modifying it to reduce the mismatch between the feed forward and the feedback signals. That's how you bootstrap the audio motor tuning. So that's happening over this dorsal path. So that's really in the analogy of dorsal two-stream models, where you're integrating sensory signals with motor actions. Okay, then we have the ventral path. So remember I said, the ventral areas, the prefrontal cortex was about decision-making and evaluation, sometimes associated with parts of executive decision-making. Broca's area 45 connects to anterior STG, so the front part of area 22 and then area 38 down here, by this pink cable connection, which is called the extreme fiber capsule system. And then ventral 2, this purple area is the FOP is connected to the anterior STG by the uncinate fasciculus. Okay. You can see what the connections. Okay, so obviously this is like a stylized version. Here's kind of more realistic image about what these connections look like. You can see how they develop over time. Again, we were talking about a bootstrap model of how these signals are tuning motor signals. So you can understand if this is particularly associated with bootstrapping. You can almost see why this dorsal pathway would change in the way that it does. This looks more like integrating up into motor cortex, where it's really having to control each one in a lot of detail. Where something gets bootstrapped, it kind of gets more integrated. That's just me speculating, but you can almost see the bootstrapping story told in this is a 7-year-old dorsal pathway versus an adult's. Why you would see this kind of evolution. Okay, but that's a speculation. All right, let me go through these. Let me just get through the anatomical areas for this session, and then we can stop. So, surrounding cytoarchitectonics. So the next two areas that she wants to look at is primary auditory cortex and Broca's area 22. Primary audio cortex, Broca's area 41, is again in this map we saw. It's hard to see it. It's this area 41 here that has these 3 gyri. But here's kind of an image of it. So these 3 gyri are different labeled areas. What's kind of confusing, so she says here they move from a medial to lateral direction. But if you look at it from the sagittal perspective, it's going from posterior to anterior, these 3 elements. But you can see, that's why I have this image here. It gets a little confusing because once they get down in there, then this is by the way right hemisphere. Most of language processing is the left hemisphere, so the core language processing. So just imagine the left hemisphere side of this for a lot of what we're going to talk about. You can see as it goes in the medial direction inside how the posterior to anterior turns into medial to lateral organization. So if you're looking at a coronal slice, here is medial to lateral. medial to lateral through a coronal slice. So that's what she means, a medial to lateral direction, even though looking at it from a sagittal perspective, it goes from posterior to anterior. That's sometimes confusing, so that's why I like this image. This part of the brain back here is called the insula. It's usually buried by the temporal lobe. That's why we like that model where you're like blowing the brain up like a balloon, because it makes the insula pop out. It used to be considered its own lobe, but now it's considered part of the frontal lobe. So then the temporal lobe and frontal lobe line would actually be this line, this sulcus here, separating insula from primary audio cortex. So this is called primary audio cortex. This is where kind of basic audio signals are coming in and get the first level of processing. So in the medial to lateral direction, which is going to be from the sagittal direction, from the anterior to the posterior direction. We see here T1, TE2, TE3, but the more medial side is the planum polare. I think this is called polare because this tip, they call the very ends of certain brain areas the poles. So this tip here is called the temporal pole. So I think the planum polare is called that because it's in the direction of the temporal pole, but I don't know if that has anything to do with it. In the middle here we have Heschel's gyrus, and then on the lateral side we have planum temporale, PT here, which is on the intersection between temporal gyrus and frontal temporal lobe with frontal lobe, and over here is parietal lobe. Alright, but you can see here, so this is Heschel's gyrus, and then Heschel's gyrus is kind of like the main one, and then the green and yellow here would be planum polare behind it, and then in front of it you would have the planum temporale. Okay, and then we have STG, superior temporal gyrus here, then we have STS, superior temporal sulcus, and then we have middle temporal gyrus. So this is the coronal view of it. And then over here is insula. Insula is doing completely different things from language. This is, things that situate you in space and other integration functions. Okay, anyway. And then she also mentioned this is Broca's area 41 here, and then just underneath it is Broca's area 42, so that's why, I don't know, I think 42 is buried in there, but it can be confusing understanding from this image. Just imagine this image. Okay, and then 22 is superior temporal gyrus, the posterior 2/3. The posterior 2/3 of the lateral convexivity, the gyrus part of the STG. So it's this part that's sticking out here. It's often labeled by a dorsal and ventral bank. So you can see it's even here. Here's the dorsal side and here's the ventral side. There's no cytoarchitectonic parcellation of Brodmann's area 22, even though it's massive. And then you do get a parcellation with area 33 on the anterior tip here, which is also very suggestive about functional difference, which we're going to see. This is kind of early processing, and this is associated with really late-term semantics processing. But it makes sense. It will make sense, especially in the way this paper introduces it, that area 22 is the neighboring part to primary auditory cortex. So there's a lot of integration, at least in the way this paper develops it, between STG and the PAC, primary auditory cortex. That may explain why this is functionally, collected. But we're going to actually talk about the difference between the dorsal side and the anterior side, the ventral side. Okay. So this is what I was saying. I already went into some detail about the dual stream model. Originally inspired from the visual system, which had a dual stream model. This is the acoustic dual stream model. We have the ventral pathway and a dorsal pathway. So on a really high level, I've already gone into some detail earlier, which is kind of a good foundation to talk about her interpretation of it. So she takes the ventral, or she's explaining kind of the general understanding. I don't know if I can say consensus understanding, but the pink ventral pathway is taken to support sound to meaning mapping, whereas the dorsal pathway is taken to support auditory motor integration. So this is Gunther's DIVA model, where you have, I just mentioned the bootstrap story earlier. You have an idea of acoustic sound that you want to make coming from here, that's integrating with articulatory instructions to develop it, and you need integration so that you can keep fine-tuning the motor signals until they match the acoustic signals, and then that develops the motor integration with sounds. So when you hear phonemes, as a mature adult, phonemes come to us as acoustic motor packages. Okay. Whereas ventral pathway is sound to meaning mapping this syntactic structure to what that means towards meaning. Okay, so we have this study, or this model, saying that the ventral pathway connecting interior temporal cortex. This is the interior part of temporal cortex with pars orbitalis, area 47. Area 47 is really small, it's down here. With area 47 and triangularis, Broca's area 45, this triangle here, via the EFCS, supports sound to meaning mapping. So again, I was saying a minute ago that this is connected with semantic processing, so it makes sense. And Broca's area is connected with syntactic processing, so it makes sense if you have that kind of simple model in mind, that this pathway is connecting syntactic processing and semantic processing, or more generally sound and meaning mapping. They're putting it in this more abstract language because it's not only syntax semantics, but there are of course lots of sounds. There's a lot of different kinds of acoustic signals that you can map to meanings that aren't necessarily language. And then Friederici, this study, talked about the ventral pathway from FOP, this very ventral part of the prefrontal cortex, via the UF to the anterior temporal cortex. The function is to support combinations of adjacent elements in a sequence. So, from her understanding, this in her model, this ventral part of Broca's area and FOP, the ventral part of prefrontal cortex underneath it, is doing the core work of syntax, which is adjacent elements, linking adjacent elements in a combinatorics, kind of logical connection of adjacent elements, which is different than syntax. Syntax, you can have distant elements linked. So in her model, she's modeling it as adjacent elements because that's a kind of early proto-syntax that you can develop that can be, like we were talking earlier about the feed-forward signal, a kind of template, a kind of fast processing signal. So we're going to talk about that more earlier, but that's her interpretation for ventral pathway. Dorsal pathway, Sauer says, et al., the dorsal path from the posterior temporal lobe to the premotor cortex and continuing to the pars apicularis. So as you can see, this goes to premotor cortex where you have the motor signals, and then this part of Broca's area, which is language motor processing classically, supports sensory motor mapping of sound to articulation. So it's that story I've already told earlier. Friederici noted about this dorsal pathway, that it went from pars apicularis BA44 here, broadens area 44 to the posterior temporal cortex via the articulofasciculus and superior longitudinal fasciculus function to support processing non-adjacent elements in syntactically complex sentences, which is just what I was mentioning earlier. Ventral Broca's area has a quick proto-syntax of adjacent elements in a sequence, whereas the posterior part of Broca's area is supporting non-adjacent elements in syntactically complex sentences. Okay, we'll get into the studies about where those models come from, but of course these two different interpretations can coexist, of course. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. Okay, this is a good place to stop. So next time I'll start from, we're gonna, now let's start at acoustic phonological analysis, PAC. Okay, so this will be the last slide because we're still talking about structure. So the default language network, parasylvian cortex. Why is this the default network? This is again the sylvian fissure, so all the cortex around the parasylvian, around the sylvian fissure is parasylvian cortex. So experiment conditions typically explain only 20% of activation variance. The rest is taken to be the default language network. So 80% when people do language tasks and you're taking an fMRI scan, 80% of the activation you're going to see that is taken to be a default language network. What that means is you're going to see this area highlight no matter what the task is. And then what studies are trying to do when they're trying to isolate different areas functionally, you have them do different tasks to see which the variance in, which is the F in fMRI, the variance between different activations in different brain areas as a function of the task. Those experiment conditions will typically explain only 20% of activation variance, and the other 80% is going to be, not really caring what your task is, which is taken to be a default language network. 80% of activity is independent of experimental conditions. So functional connectivity analysis of the default language network. These are different ways to understand the language network. So a lot of this activation is happening around the sylvian fissure. So what are we doing? So the connections between areas are helping us understand the functional relationships between areas. And there's significant correlational connectivity between Broca's area and posterior STL. So those are this Broca's area to posterior STL. And then we have this, anyway, this is an image of the functional connectivity, correlational connectivity. How would you build correlations? You can do lots of fMRI studies, and then you'll start to see correlations. When some areas light up, there'll be other areas that will be statistically likely to light up activation. So that's where they can get, you can do these studies by having a seed region. So you look at activation of your seed region and then correlate the activation to any other brain area and see which is statistically likely if you have activation of this seed region. So A here is the correlations with seed region of BA44, which was, dorsal part of Broca's area, and you can see how it's connected with the posterior part of Wernicke's area. And then here as well. So the mirrored image side on the right hemisphere, and then also Wernicke's area. By the way, there's a recent study that just came out that was doing these kind of seed region maps across different languages. And this is what English looks like. I think other grammatically similar languages, but there were other languages that had completely different profiles, which is a big footnote, caveat to this. And I think I can show that. I didn't. Okay, next time I'll even show that map because it's worth recognizing that this may be particular to the languages that they were studying. If not even, it's probably fair to say that this is cross-individual, but it might be specific to languages, which would be a big footnote to all of this. But anyway, there does seem to be a correlation between even if you did say it was across languages, you're still learning something by seeing these connections. And then even aside from functional connections, these correlational studies, you still have the dorsal pathway across different individuals. But anyway, if you seed region, if you do a correlational study to Brodmann's area 44, in the study they found high correlation with posterior area 22. And if you see, and then the FOP, which was the very ventral part of prefrontal cortex, if you use that as a seed region, you're also seeing, it's a kind of good image to see, even if it's really small on the coronal view. If you have the top-down view, you can see how much activation it has. Is correlated also with posterior area 22. Okay, so I guess the whole point of this is that this is why she's focusing on a default language network. Earlier I was saying there's a lot of areas that are involved in language. This is understood as a core area. One reason this is understood as a core area is studies like this, where there's very tight functional connections, both physical connections in terms of these fibers through white matter that connects them, but also correlational studies of activation says that this parasylvian cortex, so Broca's area, and the posterior part, PAC, primary auditory cortex, and area of Brodmann's area 22 are functionally correlated in these correlation studies. That's a reason why you'd want to study them together as a core language or as a default language network. And that's why she's looking at it here. So let me end there, and next time we'll start with primary auditory cortex. That's all.